cosa leggerai?
Welcome, everybody, to Love, Lust, and Laughter. This is my last show of 2020. So I'm saying let's conclude my show on a higher note, or should I say buzz, which is the title of my guest's book, Buzz, A Stimulating History of the Sex Toy. Hallie Lieberman, welcome to this program. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to end the year talking about dildos, as is always a fun thing to do.
Yeah, we're going to talk about dildos and other sex toys, and also current trends in the sex toy world, which is a big one. I loved your book. It's a big book. It's so well written, and of course, I know you're also you publish lots of articles, which listeners can go to your website, Hallie, Hallie Lieberman, Lieberman.com, and you'll see that she writes for lots of magazines, including Wired and the Atlantic, and so you're a good writer, and I know you're working on another book, which I'm hoping to contribute to in the future on. Tell us about your new book that you're working on.
Yeah, I'm working on a new book on the history of gigolos and gigolos in culture today, which are male sex workers with female clients. And it's very fun researching it. It's very exciting. I talk about Rudolph Valentino. I talk about the Chippendales. I talk about gigolo murders. There's a lot going on there.
I did not know Rudolph Valentino was a gigolo. I mean, I do know that I share a birthday with him, not the year, but the birthday.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
He's quite the character.
Yeah, I feel an affinity toward him, having seen him in some old movies, a couple of times, a long time ago. And I'm going to share with you down the line some of the research I did on the Japanese hosts, and they are men who work in a club, and they cater to women, including their sexual needs, if the contract is worked out. So we'll talk about that later, and let's get to your current book, Buzz, A Stimulating History. So you started out by selling sex toys, and the passion parties, and this goes back a ways. Can you give us a little bit of background about how you? Well, actually, we're going to talk about selling sex toys, and then you went for your PhD program. Well, let's talk about selling sex toys first.
Yeah, sure. So I started selling sex toys for the in-home sex toy parties, which are like Tupperware parties, except like instead of selling that like burping like Tupperware, you're selling vibrators and dildos. And I started selling them for a company called Passion Parties in Austin, Texas, in 2004, at a time when it was actually illegal to sell sex toys in Texas. So it was a pretty crazy time to be doing it. And someone from my company was actually arrested at this time.
Yeah, tell a brief version of that story. I think it's fascinating. And I know it from what you wrote in the book, it scared your mother.
It sure did. Well, so this woman who worked for my company, she had been selling sex toys outside of the parties. She'd been doing it like from like a back room or something as well. And she had pissed off her church and some members of the community because she always wore mini skirts to church. And so they did this sting operation and posed as customers, the police did, and she was arrested. And my mom found out about this, probably because I told her, and she would call me and have these teary conversations like, I don't want you to go to jail. And then my dad would be in the background, let her do whatever she wants to do, and then go back to watching college football. So that was that was kind of what was going on.
Well, but your parents, you said your father didn't care so much, but your mother was worried that you might get put in jail too.
She was worried. I mean, she's always, since growing up, it's like, don't get arrested. Like, that would obviously be a bad thing. And, she thought, like, why is it worth it for you to, sell sex toys? Like, is that worth going to jail for? I actually think it is. But my dad was like, if she got arrested, it'd be good for her career, which is probably true.
Your dad sounds like a businessman.
He is. He's a tax attorney, but yes, he is kind of has that business mentality.
Yeah. So I'm looking in your book on page 7, and the woman who got arrested was Joanne Webb.
Yeah, and Joanne Webb. And the interesting thing about Joanne is, she was a Republican. She was church going. She's not, you would think like, oh, it's a radical feminist who's arrested for selling sex toys, who has some sort of political, meaning behind this. And no, not at all. So yeah. And that's what's so interesting. For sex toys have come from the time period from radical feminists in the 60s and 70s, where they were symbols of like emancipating yourself from relationships and really getting to know your sexuality, to the 2000s, to the 21st century, where it was like sex toys can enhance your relationships and let's fit them within heterosexual marriage.
And but at the passion parties, the early days, and I remember reading, I guess it was Pat Davis's book some years ago, and a lot of women made good money by hosting these sex toy parties. And I remember going to a conference in, I think about 2001 in Texas. And we, in our conferences, in the exhibit halls, we almost always have sex toys. We weren't allowed to have sex toys at that Texas conference. Texas, and I guess they've now come around, but what about, isn't Alabama, it's still illegal to have sex toys in Alabama?
It's illegal to sell sex toys in Alabama. I think you can possess them. But it's kind of, and no one's really been prosecuted, but the idea, like, even with the Texas law, it was like very few people were prosecuted. But if you pissed off the wrong people, if you piss off your community, they, could use this law and come after you. So having it on the books is a dangerous thing, because then the law can be used selectively, and it's always a problem. So yeah, Alabama is the last remaining state.
Yeah, well, we've come a long ways, but we still have some distance to go, and during the course of our discussion today, we'll get into that. So let's talk about your chapter 2, where you call it From Cavemen to Kinsey. And you enrolled in 2008 in a PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you wanted to study the history of sex toys. And then what happened?
Well, yeah, so I wanted to study the history of sex toys, and my advisor, who I chose, to be quite honest, because I thought he was lazy. He won't be listening to this probably. And I thought he wouldn't care what I did. Well, anyway, my advisor, I went to meet with him, and a lot of times he'd been watching baseball when I went to meet with him, which was fine. It was great. But he said, why don't you wait to study sex toys until after you get tenure? Because it's too controversial. And then I said, well, like, no one's getting tenure now. So if I wait then, until then, I may never get tenure. I may never get to study it. I'm not going to do that. And I said, look, if I can't get a job, Chili's Bar and Grill, which I'd worked at as a waitress, said they would always take me back. So I will go back. If studying sex toys screws up my career, I will always have a job at Chili's. So.
Yes, but your mind was not so much on Chili's. It was more on stimulating sex toys, and of course your PhD dissertation must have fueled the book, your book buzz, with lots of information.
Yeah, exactly. So after that, he said, "Okay, fine, you can study this," and then he, taught me archival research and helped me with that, and was really useful. And all the stuff I found with my dissertation most of it made it into the book, and then the book expanded on that. But I really wanted to write a book that wasn't just an academic book and speaking to other academics. I wanted to write a book for the general public.
And you do it so well. The stories you tell and your writing is good. It's a wonderful book, Hallie, and Hallie, and I'm so glad to have you with us today, and you can spread the information, because, well, we'll get to current trends. Of course, we all know sex toy sales are way up in the pandemic, but talk a little bit, if you will, about the ancient sex toys that were found. I'm aware of these from going to museums over the years and just being interested. And even Good Vibrations has a vibrator museum, but we're talking really old. Talk about the really old sex toys that were found in ancient Egypt and China, Greece, and so on.
Yeah, so we have these things, and I want to be clear that we don't know if people masturbated with them, because people don't write about their masturbation. But the oldest, or didn't back then, but the oldest sex toys around 30,000 years old, and it was found in this cave in southwestern Germany. And it's this phallus that we don't know what people did with it. There's scratches on it that indicate it could have been used for tool making. But as I write in the book, there's no reason you need, or tool sharpening, there's no reason you need to sharpen a tool on a giant penis, which leads me to believe that they were used for other things. So we find these phallic batons in the Ice Age period, and we don't know what they're for, but they're the first kind of phalluses that human beings created. And it's kind of amazing to me that they go back that far.
It is. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. You say in your book, the Oxford English Dictionary defines dildo as a word of obscure origin used in the refrain of ballads. Some believe the word may have come from diletto, an Italian word for a woman's delight, or dally, which means to toy. I think this history is wonderful, and human sexuality is so important to us, and having more pleasure is so important. So the ancients knew that too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the ancient Greeks loved phallic symbols. They had dildos. The god Priapus, or Priapus, I always pronounce it wrong, is a fertility god that was all over the place with this giant erect penis. They put statues in gardens to try to get the gardens to grow. I think we should bring that back in the 21st century. I would love that. I would have a garden if we did that. That would be so cool. But the Greek, yeah, but the Greek dildos were made of a lot of them were made of leather, and they used olive oil as lubricant. And we don't know much about how they were used, but we do see them depicted on vases. You see like women penetrating themselves with them. They're filleting dildos. They're sometimes carrying them around in a basket for harvest festivals. So they were there. We don't know how they were used, but they were recognizable enough that people would see them on a vase and say, that's a dildo. I know what that is.
Yes. And then in the Japanese culture, I spent some time, as I mentioned at the top of the show, in Japan, both for as a tourist, but later as a researcher for the Japanese hosts. But so I believe that we talk about it in your book. the Japanese introduced to the United States Benoit balls.
Yes.
So and the term means, you write, revolving jewels in Japanese.
Yeah.
Uh, so actually, these things can be very good for strengthening the vagina, much as doing Kegels would do. But tell us what you know about the Benoit balls and how in your research about the Japanese.
Yeah. So Benoit balls actually came from Japan. They were around, hundreds of years ago. I would say in the 1800s, maybe the 1700s. And the Japanese Benoit balls, one was hollow and one had this liquid inside of it. Sometimes it was mercury, filled with mercury, which you shouldn't do today, and we wouldn't do today. But so the people would wear them, or would be instructed to wear them while walking around the house, wear them in their vagina. And the balls would create like vibrations, and they were supposedly very popular with geishas and prostitutes. But their origin, it's hard to know the history. But by the 20th century, there were some people importing Benoit balls to the US, so in the 1960s. And they were controversial. In fact, some sex toy stores were like, we don't want to carry these because they aren't giving women orgasms. So they're not really sex toy stores, like what you were talking about. Yeah.
You also say in your chapter 2 that this is from your book, of the many regions I researched, the most difficult place to trace a culture's history with sex toys was, surprisingly enough, America. Books on the history of pornography basically ignored sex toys. What else? Tell our listening audience what else you discovered that in terms of sex toys and America and the history. What did you discover?
Yeah, well, it was like, there was so little written about the history of sex toys. It was so hard to find a history. And what was out there was stuff about, it would be like one line in a 300-page book. And it would be like, oh yeah, our censors tried to censor sex toys as well in the 19th century, along with condoms. So it was like these little snippets, but very little. And so I took that snippet, I would get that information, and then I would expand on it. So that was in the 19th century. There was this Christian fundamentalist in New York City who ended up he started working for the Young Man Christians Association. His name was Anthony Comstock, and he ended up working for the Postal Service, getting a job for them. And he went, starting in New York, and he confiscated sex toys all around New York, along with condoms. They were called immoral rubber goods. And that was a term encompassing any sort of rubber thing like a condom or a sex toy that he thought was bad. And he would confiscate them. He was also anti-Semitic. He didn't like Jews. So he would say, oh, I saw a Hebrew walking down the street. That Hebrew works for this, So it was a whole thing. And then they spread this anti-sex toy campaign to other rubber making areas, including Ohio, which was really big with producing rubber objects. So there's this whole campaign in the US that very few people ever talked about.
It's just fascinating. I want to, because this show is only an hour long, I want to jump ahead now to your chapter 4, and you talk about Betty Dodson. And Betty Dodson was a friend of mine. She died about a month and a half ago. No, I think she died on Halloween. I loved Betty, and she was a good friend. And if people want to look back into the archives of a couple of months ago, I did a show with Dr. Mark Schoen, who was also a friend of Betty Dodson. And you can listen to our show giving a tribute to Betty Dodson. She was one of a kind. And now there's apparently a Betty Dodson because she was also a wonderful artist, a fine artist. And now there's apparently a Betty Dodson show in the Erotic Museum in New York City. Um, but Betty Dodson said, and this is from your book, if I couldn't touch my own body for pleasure, I was a victim hoping to get the kind of sex from a partner who would provide adequate stimulation of my clitoris that lasted long enough for me to have an orgasm, Dodson says. Even if that happened, I would still be dependent on each lover for all my orgasms. This kind of sexual dependency led to resentment, which fueled the war between the sexes. She said that early on, and it got people's attention, didn't it? Betty Dodson.
Oh my God, yes. She was such a radical, and she basically was advocating for women learning to, give themselves sexual pleasure. She was a masturbation advocate at a time when even men masturbating, which has always been more accepted, was still controversial, and some people thought masturbation could make you go blind. They thought it was very damaging, and that she was saying this in the 1960s. And she believes, like from this quote, that if you truly wanted to liberate yourself from this kind of like heterosexual culture where you have to depend on, the husband provides everything and you have to depend on him for sexual pleasure and for financial stability, the only way to liberate yourself is to get to know your own body and get to know how to give yourself an orgasm. So then you won't be dependent on a man for your sexual pleasure, and you can be independent. And that was a radical idea then, and it's a radical idea today.
It is. And she also, her philosophy included, and you write about this, that masturbation was liberating because it allowed women to learn about their bodies' own sexual responses. Until women knew how to bring themselves pleasure, they would not be able to take control of their own sexuality. That is so true. And I remember in the late 80s and early 90s, I co-led 2 women's sexuality groups in Santa Clara. It was just south of where I lived at the time, Palo Alto. And these groups all the women had sexual trauma. We had 2 groups every Wednesday. And most of the women who had experienced rape or sexual assault or sexual abuse, all this kind of trauma, were unable to have orgasms. So their homework was to masturbate to orgasm and to do it with a vibrator. A vibrator can go so much faster than any tongue or penis or finger can go. And so these women did learn how to bring themselves to orgasm. And it was liberating for them. And then they could go on and teach their partner, if they had one, what kind of pleasure they liked.
Yeah, that's amazing that you were doing this. And did you get any feedback from the women about were their partners open to it, the ones who had partners?
Yeah, most of them actually did have partners, although most of them had before they started the group, rather sexless relationships because they had all of this emotional sexual baggage from the sexual trauma of their youth. But we would, every several months, we would have a separate group for the women who had partners and bring the partners in and sort of educate the partners too. It was for the time, late 80s up till the mid 90s, it was fairly progressive. And, and of course the women were thrilled to finally feel that they felt they could feel safe in the group and sharing their stories. And then they could feel more comfortable with masturbation because they'd done it themselves using a vibrator. And the vibrators then were not as sophisticated as they are now. But they did the job.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's amazing. And I was asking about partners because I know there were two, like for Betty Dodson, when she was promoting vibrators within the feminist movement, there were two kind of, strains of people who were against them. And Betty Dodson was doing a similar thing with teaching women how to use vibrators, except she was using them in actually, like, women would get naked in a circle and she would teach them how to have orgasms in a group, which not all women are comfortable with, of course. But the a lot of feminists in the second wave movement were kind of negative towards vibrators. They said they were unnatural, and if you really understood your body, you wouldn't need a device. And I mean, were you facing that in the 80s as well? Like, with women saying, I shouldn't be using this?
A little bit, but most of the women chose to come to the groups.
Okay.
And they paid money to be in a group. So they were stuck, and they didn't want to live in this sexual darkness forever. So I didn't get so much of that. By the time I got to UCLA's Female Sexual Medicine Center in the early 2000s, and the urologist, the female urologist I worked with, she did some research, and she hypothesized that if women had not masturbated as teenagers up until about the time of maybe 25 years of age, which is when we think the brain stops growing, right? But if they had not masturbated, they probably were not having orgasms because those neural pathways that go from the genitals to the brain, or the brain to the genitals, it's a circuit, had not been laid down. And so these women who came to the Female Sexual Medicine Center at UCLA often had a lot of sexual problems, including lack of orgasm. And so the vibrator is what brought them to orgasm. And they needed that extra stimulation since those neural pathways had not been laid down. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, it's fascinating. It is. And, I know, like, there's this kind of shame that some people feel like that they need to use a vibrator. But if you have the science behind it saying, if you didn't masturbate until 25, you won't be able to have an orgasm easier. I think that can help overcome the shame that some people feel.
Yes. And a lot of times if they just, I had in my practice for the better part of a year, a woman of about, let's see, late 30s, happens to be a medical doctor. And she was in a pretty good marriage, and but wanted to have an orgasm, and she'd never had an orgasm. And so I suggested the We Vibe Touch, which is kind of splayed. You know how it looks. And it doesn't look like a dildo, but it can stimulate the clitoris and even the labia. And underneath the labia are the vestibular bulbs, which can fill up and add to the arousal. She had her first orgasm. And I mentioned that she is a doctor because she knows female anatomy, but she needed that touch vibrator in order to have her first orgasm. And she did. And the next session, this is back before the pandemic, she came in smiling. One reason I love being a sex therapist, the feedback is pretty direct and immediate.
That's incredible that gave her first orgasm. And it's not unusual for women in their late 30s and even 40s to not have had an orgasm, which breaks my heart.
Yeah, me too. And orgasms can get better. And as a woman gets to know her own body better and her responsiveness, and if she's in a relationship that's good, where she feels safe, her amygdala gets to take a nap. The amygdala housing fears. So the amygdala takes a nap in her brain, and she's able to be present and breathe and feel safe. And thereby she can let go more easily and reach the orgasm. But some of those conditions or all of those conditions have to be in place for this to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And
So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking about, your story reminds me of when I was in the archives researching my book, and there was a letter to Dell Williams, who created the first female-owned sex toy store in the late 1970s, and there was a letter to her by a 40-year-old woman who had her first orgasm with a vibrator. And she said her husband, 20 years of marriage, had never given her an orgasm. And then she actually ended up divorcing her husband, which is like the male fear of sex toys, that women will use them, have an orgasm, and leave. And it usually doesn't happen that way, but sometimes it did.
Yeah, let's segue. That's a very good place. Let's talk about the male fear of orgasms, because some men have that fear, and they feel intimidated by the vibrator. And I have a great reframe for my clients, and that is, see the when I'm talking to a couple and there's the guy there and he's not so sure about bringing a vibrator, a sex toy, into the relationship. And, I suggest that he see the vibrator as a friend, because the vibrator will never get tired, and he can learn to use it creatively, and even incorporate the stimulation of the vibrator into the lovemaking with his own oral skills or manual skills. And it can be mind-blowing to have that kind of a orgasm when you've got the human and the toy both stimulating you.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the best kinds of orgasms. And I think seeing the vibrator as like a friend or an extension of your own body, as opposed to something you're competing with, like a rival in the bedroom, is a really important thing.
Yeah, but some men need to be, that is important, and some men need to be a little more confident, I think, and that may not come overnight. They might need some therapy around that. Let's see, in your book, you talk about this guy. His last name is Duncan's dildos, and one woman wrote to say, pleasantly, I'm on 2 weeks vacation, and every day as a rule I leave myself properly satisfied as many as 4 times, after which I don't really need a man. And then you write, sex toys could coexist with relationships with men, some customers asserted. And that's where you talk some about men and sex toys. It's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But your sex life with your partner can really get much more exciting. And the other thing is, it brings novelty into the relationship. And we need, in monogamous, or even if you have a long-term relationship that you sometimes open up, you still need novelty. And when you have novelty in the relationship, you get more dopamine, and dopamine is the hormone of arousal. And so sex toys can bring the novelty. So, so talk about that a little bit, if you will.
Hallie. Yeah, and so, it's interesting because, sex toys bring the novelty, and to bring it to like current trends, we're all locked in our homes. Couples are not having the novelty during the pandemic that they have had in the past. Because even novel experiences, like new experiences with a partner, are going to make you more attracted to them. We're not having new experiences. So I think that's why we're seeing an increase in sex toy sales, because people are, needing to bring that novelty into monogamy. And even people who aren't monogamous right now because of the pandemic aren't, bringing, having extra partners on the side. So we desperately need that novelty. And I think that's why you're seeing this.
And that's why let's just jump to the current trends. We can come back to your book, but specifically. But let's talk about the current trends because sex toy sales have increased dramatically during COVID. Uh, can you talk as you did in our pre-interview yesterday about what New York City recommended some time ago?
Oh yeah. The New York City Health Department recommended masturbation as a way to help stop the spread of the virus, and it was reminiscent of in the 1980s when health departments were trying to stop the spread of AIDS, and they weren't promoting masturbation, but gay men's health groups were. They said, you know what, here's how to do safer sex. You could have masturbation groups similar to Betty Dodson's groups, where you have everyone in a circle masturbating, but they're not spreading the HIV virus. Similar thing now, except our virus is airborne, so you can't have the masturbation groups. So the health department's saying just masturbate on your own. And it's kind of radical for a health department to be promoting masturbation because in 1994, Jocelyn Elders was fired as Surgeon General for promoting masturbation during the Clinton administration. So
I know what that was really unfortunate that she got fired.
It was so. I actually interviewed her a couple months ago, and we talked about it. And she laughs about it. She says she's still friends with Clinton, or friendly with Clinton. And she said someone needed to take the hit, in that administration. But I mean, of course, there's the irony. Clinton, in his personal life was having sex with everybody, but that's another story.
Yeah, we don't want to veer off into that. I have mentioned the ultimate name drop that I'm still friends with Bill Clinton. I dated him when he was a Rhodes Scholar in 1969 in England, and he appointed me in 1995. He appointed me to the White House Conference on Aging, and I was the only delegate there to talk about love and sexuality. And so, and I as recently as last year, my husband and I saw Bill and Hillary, and so I've stayed friends with him, and he's very open about sexuality. And I think his intentions to have Jocelyn Elders be in that position was very good. What a shame! What a shame!
Yeah, it wasn't. She didn't take it personally. She knew that he had to, like, politically, he had to fire her, but she said she didn't take it personally.
Well, that's good. So let's talk about, I'm going to jump forward to your chapter 15, and let's talk about the 21st century toys and a little bit about Good Vibrations and Joni Blank and Carol Queen. These are people that I knew or know, and let's talk a little bit about that, chapter 15.
Sure. So Good Vibrations was the second women's owned sex toy store in the U.S. It was started by Joni Blank in 1977 in San Francisco. And it was also controversial because Joni Blank was a part of the feminist movement, and she's promoting masturbation and vibrators at a time when you have people like Betty Friedan saying 1,000 vibrators won't make a dent in the women's movement. She there are people saying, why are you talking about women's sexuality now when we recently got the right to have an abortion, when we're trying to get, more political power? This is frivolous. And so Joni Blank, to start this store, she was really had to fight against that. It was, now we see vibrators as a part of the feminist movement. Back then, it was very controversial. And I remember talking to her, and she said there were a lot of men would come in the store and ask for vibrators for their wives or partners, because their partners were too embarrassed to come into the store. And I found that very interesting. And she would try to encourage them to get women to come into the store. But it sometimes it was difficult. There was a stigma.
there was a stigma, and during that time, I lived in Palo Alto and made, frequented San Francisco and went to Vibrations in those early days, and thought it was wonderful. She had female-friendly women who staffed Good Vibrations. She's still Dr. Carol Queen, who's been on this program several times and is a friend. Dr. Carol Queen continues to work there as the staff sexologist, and you write this in your book, historian and curator of the Antique Vibrator Museum. So I have sent couples in the past to Good Vibrations in San Francisco, and here in Seattle, there is Babeland, and I guess Good Vibrations bought Babeland. Is that what happened?
They did. So Babeland was another pioneering feminist sex toy store, and Good Vibrations got bought out by a big company, and that company bought Babeland.
Yeah, but the thing that they have preserved, which I think is great, and I've been to the Babeland here in Seattle, in fact, about, probably 5 years ago now, there was a wonderful lecture given right in the store on cannabis and sex. And that's a whole nother show, but which I've done actually. but I've had the same experience with sending couples to Babeland where they were a little embarrassed. These are older couples who've been married a while, right? And they do want to spice up their relationship. And I've heard back from some of them, I was kind of embarrassed to go, but the sales lady was just so helpful and so friendly and told us a lot about what the toy could do and could not do, depending. And the female-friendly and clean store is really important.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a really good point. What was revolutionary about Good Vibrations was at the time, almost all sex toy stores were catered to men. The male gaze, there was pornography for men, which was basically all pornography at the time, peppering the store. Sex toys were way in the back. Most women would not be caught dead in a sex toy store. They did not, if a woman went in there, she was a floozy, she was a slut, they were not hospitable to women, and sex toys were still marginally legal. A lot of states had anti-sex toy laws. To put sex toys out in the open in a boutique like Joni Blank did and say, women are welcome here. We want women. This is for women, and sex toys are out of the shadows. And this is a store for women. That was huge. It was revolutionary. And it did a really, people like Carol Queen and Susie Bright, who worked in the store, they did so much to shift the perception and brought so much joy to people's lives and gave people their first orgasms through selling them sex toy stores. It just was revolutionary.
Really, really true. And I have to tell you one more little story about, so in the early 90s with Dr. Walter Bortz, a medical doctor, I did 2 studies on aging and sexuality. And one of them involved lectures and follow-up with the people attending. It was the Palo Alto Senior Center, which at the time, now this is pre-Viagra, at the time, the people attending were older people, and because it was Palo Alto, which is where Stanford is, they tended to be very well educated. So they were open, a little more open. The two seemed to go together. And so several of the ladies that were attending this aging and sexuality workshop at the Palo Alto Senior Center, they knew that I was in private practice, and I had an older ladies group for women who were divorced and widowed. And they met in my office in Palo Alto, separate from the study that Dr. Bortz and I were doing. And I'll never forget, it was about, it was 1991, and it was just before Christmas, maybe 92. And at the end of the session, all of these women left the session giggling because they were going to have a field trip to San Francisco's Good Vibrations. And they were going to get some of their own sex toys, and they were going to buy some sex toys for some of their more enlightened friends. So
That's amazing.
So happy. They were so happy.
That is so awesome. I would have loved to witness that trip. And that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's well, when we stay open to sexuality and when we read books like yours and books like mine, Love in the Time of Corona, we have more knowledge about sexuality. Somebody did a study a long time ago, small study, wondering, do sex therapists have better sex than the rest of us? Well, it turns out we do, because we can have sex without anxiety. We have so much knowledge. Like I'm sitting in my study doing this Zoom audio, and to my right is a whole wall of books, and most of them are on sexuality. And so I know a lot. I've been doing this work for nearly 35 years. So I know a lot. And most sex therapists do know a lot. They have to. It's part of their work. So we can have sex with less anxiety because we have the knowledge. So that's what other people need, is more knowledge and more kind of openness. Let's see what we can do here. And that's a lot of what my clients benefit from, the homework assignments I give them. And then to be accountable, because they're paying me for the next session, I'm going to ask, did you do your homework? So all of this works to give them more information, more knowledge, and more confidence, more sexual confidence.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the keys, like throughout the history of sex toys, which these sex toy stores, like founded by Joni, like Good Vibrations and Del Williams, Eve's Garden, it was about knowledge as well. Eve's Garden had 3 things they sold when the store started. 2 were vibrators. One was a Hitachi magic wand. One was a vibrator that no longer exists. And one was Betty Dodson's book, Liberating Masturbation. Because the idea, it wasn't just that you needed to buy a vibrator and that was it. It was you needed this book, which Liberating Masturbation had her wonderful drawings. You mentioned Dodson was a great artist, gorgeous drawings of female bodies and vulvas, and it explained how the female body worked. And so this was the instruction manual for your body, and the vibrator was how to optimize your body. And I think that education component of the women's sex toy stores was what was missing from the male sex toy stores. The male sex toy stores were just like, here's a dildo, have fun. It's probably not safe, and it might, give you a rash. But the women's sex toy stores were all about education, and that is so key. And like the kind of work you're doing with your clients, that takes it another step further, working with a therapist. But education about your own body and the knowledge is just so important.
Yeah, it is. And over the years, since about 1994, I have narrated or co-narrated about 7 sex education films for the Sinclair Institute. And that these are really important. I'm looking at my study, and Great Sex for a Lifetime, volumes 1 and 2, or the last 2 that I did, and that focuses on baby boomers. Some years before that, I narrated with a urologist, Great Sex Over 40. And a lot of people need the visuals. In addition to good information, they need the visuals. So we had real couples demonstrating explicitly, but in good taste. I mean, it wasn't porn. We used real couples. They weren't porn actors, but most of them were swingers. Because not all couples are going to want to be so exhibitionistic that they're willing to be naked in front of a camera and have sex. So we had real couples, but so many people need the visuals to learn. And so sex ed videos are important too. You have a quote from Betty Dodson. regarding 50 Shades of Grey, which was such a phenomenon. 50 Shades, she says, this is from your book. If nothing else, this is Betty Dodson. If nothing else, the popularity of 50 Shades tells us that women have not made one step forward in claiming their own sexual power. They are still waiting for that prince. And I used to say that, going back to those women's groups that I co-led when I was in California, that a lot of the women had the idea that someday my prince will come, and so will I. So it's waiting for that prince. Betty Dodson says it, and I think a lot of women are waiting for the stars to align and the prince. Taking responsibility for your own sexuality is so important, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's still this attitude. I mean, Dodson was talking about, 50 Shades of Grey, 2011, I think the book came out, or the movie came out then. But yeah, I mean, for her, this was so frustrating because this was the message she had been fighting against for like 50 years, which was, don't wait for your prince. Your prince may not give you an orgasm. Even if he can, you need to have one before then. And so 50 Shades was kind of like heralded in the press as this, revolutionary story that promoted sex toys, and there were whole lines of 50 Shades of Grey sex toys. But really, when you read the story, it's about a man using sex toys on a woman, and it's about a virgin getting enlightened about her sexuality from a rich man. And it's very, regressive story. And so Dodson was frustrated about that. I was frustrated about that as well. And this goes into this thing with sex toys where it's, the idea that sex toys are more socially acceptable now is great. But when we look at what conditions and what situations are more socially acceptable, they are these traditional heterosexual monogamous relationships that are recreating, gender roles that people are fighting against. They're still not, they're getting a little bit more acceptable for masturbation, but the mass market, like sex toys, the first sex toys we saw in Walgreens and CVS were cock rings for men to wear during sex, not, a phallic vibrator for a woman to use during masturbation. And I think it's very telling.
It is. And by the way, the cock ring, for the listeners who don't know, probably most do these days, but the cock ring is designed to help keep the blood in the penis. And it works for many men, so to keep his erection. But you toward the end of your book, you say something profound that I'd like you to expand on a bit, Hallie. And that is, you say sex toys can't change the world on their own, but the people making them, selling them, using them, and talking about them can. And you talk about, you say, to me, sex toys symbolize hope, because what I see when I look at a sex toy is the people who I profiled in this book, the people who woke up one day and wanted to change the world, and they thought of themselves, and they thought to themselves that a dildo was a way to do it. I am one of those people. And I'm no longer embarrassed. Yes, you are one of those people. Of course you are.
Yeah.
Yes, talk about the meaning of sex toys, as you do in that conclusion in your book. Hello?
Oh, sorry, that cut out a bit. Hi. Sorry, that cut out a bit. Could you repeat that?
Oh, yes. I think we're coming to the end of the show, so John, he'll let me know. But if you talk about the meaning of sex toys, the technology has improved, but there's meaning around it too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the technology has improved, and sex toys, as I say, like sex toys themselves don't change the world, but it is the meaning of them, it is how they're used, it is the education that comes with them. like if we bring this to the present day, we're seeing sex toys for non-binary people and for trans people. And sex toys are always a reflection of the culture we're in. And the culture, as a culture shifts, our view of sex toys and what is and isn't acceptable shifts, but the culture shifts slower. So just having sex toys out and being popular isn't enough. We need to make sure the values behind them are the values we're trying to, that we want in our culture. And that even goes into racially insensitive sex toys, which I wrote about this year for Marie Claire, that still exist out there. I mean, there's a lot packed into a sex toy, a lot of meaning. And to be truly liberated, we have to look at that.
Yes, indeed. This is all profound, and I'm so glad that we have you on this planet, because you're helping open up conversations, and that's important. By the way, going back to 50 Shades of Grey, at least that the books and then the subsequent movies, it did begin conversations, even though the 50 Shades was not so friendly toward females and liberation, but it started conversations, and we always need. Your work starts conversations, and I'm so glad we've had this conversation today. It's made it. I say today because here I am in Seattle, and it's going on 3:00. But for you guys you're now in Florida, aren't you? But you're in Florida. So
yeah, I'm in Venice, Florida right now.
Yeah. So you're going to go back home to Atlanta, and you said to me on a pre-interview that you have your work to do there too. Well, I that's my observation. But you said that in Atlanta, some people think that porn and sex toys cause crime.
Yes. In Atlanta, there is a campaign against a local sex toy store owner who's been there for over 20 years. And he has put sex toy stores, they're tasteful sex toy stores with very well lit, but he has been, they've tried to zone him out of existence in Atlanta and the suburbs. And one of the arguments is that bringing a sex toy store in the neighborhood will cause crime, will decrease property values and things like this. And that goes into the idea, it's like sex toy stores are only going to like there's no evidence that happens, that it increases crime and stuff. But this it shows how kind of regressive our cultural ideas are around sex toys, that we still think that a dildo will cause violence, and so it's kind of ridiculous. But another thing that we haven't gone over is Instagram and Facebook still don't allow sex toy advertising. So in a lot of ways, we're more progressive, but in some ways we really aren't.
This has been a wonderful interview. I'm so grateful that you've been on the show. I'm definitely going to have you back. You and I are going to talk off the air. And I do thank you so much. Hallie Lieberman. People, I'm going to put it in my show notes. Her website is fascinating. HALLIE Lieberman.com. And thank you so much for being on the program today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll do it again. And I'm wishing everybody out there listening a better 2021. We have to have faith that it's going to get better. This pandemic is still with us, but it's going to get better. And we can maybe take away some lessons from it and maybe make our relationships better because we've had the time to be together. And that's so. All right. Well, I think we're at the end here, so we'll stop. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks again. And Happy New Year, everybody.